Montana Territory, 1872. The harsh winter wind whipped across the open plains, carrying with it the promise of another brutal season. Colton Keating pulled his wool collar tighter around his neck, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air as he guided his horse along the snow-dusted trail toward the small settlement of Pine Ridge. At 25, Colton had already spent 7 years working cattle drives, his youthful face weathered slightly by sun and wind, but still handsome with clear blue eyes and a strong jawline, currently sporting 3 days of light stubble that he planned to shave once he reached town. The lonesome trail suited him well enough, or at least that was what he told himself. Since losing his parents to typhoid 5 years earlier, Colton had convinced himself that attachment only led to heartache. A man's better off relying on no one but himself out here, he'd repeat like a prayer whenever the night grew too quiet around the campfire. The frontier demanded self-reliance, and Colton had built his entire identity around the notion that forming connections would only make him vulnerable when the harsh realities of frontier life inevitably tore them away. Pine Ridge appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures huddled together against the vast wilderness. Colton had accepted a position as foreman at the Rocking M Ranch outside town, planning to work through winter before likely moving on when spring came. That was his pattern, never staying anywhere long enough for roots to take hold. The job promised good pay and a roof over his head during the coldest months, which was all a sensible cowboy needed. As he rode down the main street, his stallion's hooves crunching through the thin layer of snow, he noticed a woman struggling with an armload of supplies outside the general store. Her basket had tipped, spilling flour and other goods onto the boardwalk. Without thinking, Colton dismounted and approached her. "Allow me to help, ma'am," he said, kneeling to gather the scattered items. "Thank you kindly," she replied, and when she looked up, Colton felt something unexpected stir within him. She couldn't have been more than 22, with striking amber eyes and honey-blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a practical bonnet. Despite the simplicity of her blue calico dress, mended in places but clean and well cared for, there was a natural beauty about her that caught Colton off guard. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and though she smiled, he noticed a sadness lingering in her eyes. "I'm much obliged for your assistance, sir. I'm afraid I was trying to carry more than I should have." Her voice carried a gentle southern lilt. "Happy to help, Colton Keating," he said, tipping his hat. "Just arrived in town." "Faith Browning," she replied, then glanced down at a small boy who had been partially hidden behind her skirts. "And this is my son, Thomas." The child, no more than 4 years old, regarded Colton with solemn blue eyes, clutching his mother's skirts with one hand. "Pleased to meet you both," Colton said, feeling suddenly awkward. He wasn't accustomed to speaking with children. "Let me help you with these packages. Where are you headed?" Faith hesitated briefly. "We live just outside town. My wagon's tied up over there, but I can manage from here." "Nonsense," Colton insisted, gathering the heavier items. "I'd be a poor excuse for a gentleman if I let you struggle with all this." As they walked to her wagon, Faith explained that she was a widow. Her husband, James, had been killed in a mining accident almost 2 years earlier, leaving her to run their small farm alone with young Thomas. "The farm belonged to James's parents," she said as they loaded the supplies. "They passed on before we married, and now it's all Thomas and I have left." She spoke matter-of-factly, but Colton detected the strain beneath her composed exterior. Before he could respond, a commotion erupted from the saloon down the street. 2 men burst through the batwing doors, shouting and shoving each other. "Thomas, come here," Faith said quickly, pulling her son protectively behind her. The men's argument escalated rapidly. When one drew his pistol, Colton instinctively stepped in front of Faith and Thomas. The shot that rang out struck the hitching post several feet away, sending splinters flying and horses whinnying in fear. Faith's wagon team jolted, threatening to bolt. Colton lunged for the reins while townsfolk scattered for cover. He managed to calm the horses, holding them steady until the sheriff emerged and subdued the brawlers. Faith's face had gone pale, but she maintained her composure for her son's sake. "Thank you again, Mr. Keating. I believe we should head home now." "Allow me to escort you," Colton found himself saying. "Those horses are still skittish, and the trail can be dangerous for a woman and child alone." Faith studied him for a moment, weighing her options. "That's very kind, but—" "Please, Ma," Thomas said, speaking for the first time. "I don't want the bad men to come back." Something in the boy's earnest fear made Faith relent. "Very well, Mr. Keating. We would appreciate your company." The Browning farm lay 3 miles outside Pine Ridge, a modest operation with a small cabin, barn, and perhaps 40 acres of land. As they approached, Colton noted the sagging fence line and weathered roof in need of repair. Faith had been keeping the place together with determination alone, but the coming winter would be unforgiving to such vulnerabilities. "It isn't much," Faith said quietly, noticing his assessment, "but it's home." After helping unload the supplies, Colton found himself reluctant to leave. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice your roof could use some attention before the heavy snows come." Faith straightened her back, pride evident in her posture. "I'm planning to get to it. We manage just fine, Mr. Keating." "I'm sure you do," he said quickly, not wanting to offend, "but I've got experience with such repairs. I'm starting work at the Rocking M tomorrow, but I could come by Sunday after church to lend a hand." "We cannot pay you," she said plainly. "I'm not asking for payment," Colton replied, surprised by his own insistence, "just being neighborly." Faith considered him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Thomas and I would be grateful for the help then." As Colton rode toward the Rocking M, he puzzled over his offer. Getting involved with a widow and her child went against every rule he'd set for himself. Attachments meant complications, and complications inevitably led to pain. Yet something about Faith Browning's quiet strength and the solemn eyes of her young son had pierced straight through his carefully constructed defenses. "Just fixing a roof," he muttered to himself, "nothing more than that." But as the silhouette of the Rocking M ranch house appeared on the horizon, Colton knew he was already breaking his own most fundamental rule. Never care too much about anyone in this unforgiving land. The following Sunday, after church services, Colton arrived at the Browning farm with tools and materials loaded in a borrowed wagon. He found Faith in the garden, harvesting the last of the fall vegetables before the ground froze completely. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Browning," he called, tipping his hat. She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands onto her apron. Today her honey-blonde hair was partially visible beneath a simple bonnet, the golden strands catching the autumn sunlight. "Mr. Keating," she acknowledged with a small smile. "You actually came." "I gave my word," he replied simply, unloading the wagon. "And please call me Colton." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "Faith, then," she conceded. "Thomas will be pleased to see you. He's been watching the road since sunrise." As if summoned by his name, the boy emerged from behind the cabin, clutching a wooden horse. Upon seeing Colton, his solemn expression brightened slightly. "You brought a real hammer," Thomas observed, approaching cautiously. Colton knelt to the boy's level. "I did. Would you like to help me? Every good workman needs an assistant." Thomas nodded seriously, and Colton felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest at the boy's earnest response. The afternoon passed quickly as Colton worked on the roof, while Thomas handed up nails and tools with grave concentration. Faith prepared a simple but hearty meal of stew and corn bread, which they ate together at the small kitchen table. The domesticity of the scene struck Colton as both foreign and oddly comfortable. "How are you finding work at the Rocking M?" Faith asked, serving him a second helping without being asked. "Good, steady work," Colton replied. "Mr. Marshall runs a fair outfit. I'm to oversee the winter feeding operation and help prepare for spring calving." "The Marshalls are good people," Faith said. "They've been kind to Thomas and me." Colton noticed how she straightened her shoulders when mentioning their kindness, as if determined not to appear pitiable. Her pride impressed him almost as much as her resilience. "If you don't mind my asking," he ventured, "how do you manage the farm on your own?" Faith's expression tightened slightly. "We get by. I grow what vegetables I can, keep chickens for eggs, and the milk cow provides enough for our needs. I take in sewing and laundry for extra money." She paused. "It's not the life I envisioned, but we're making our way." "Your husband," Colton began carefully, "was he a farmer before the mining?" A shadow crossed Faith's face. James always had big dreams. The farm was steady but didn't satisfy his ambitions. When they discovered silver in the mountains, he couldn't resist trying his luck. She glanced at Thomas, who was focused on his meal. "He was going to make us rich, buy a grand house in town, instead." She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Colton had seen too many men chase dreams into early graves. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Faith nodded, then deliberately brightened her tone. "Thomas, would you like to show Mr. Keating your special tree before he leaves?" The boy perked up. "Can I, Ma?" "Of course, sweetheart." Thomas led Colton behind the barn to a young oak tree, perhaps 15 feet tall. "Pa planted it when I was born," the boy explained solemnly. "Ma says it grows as I grow." Colton felt something twist in his chest. "That's a fine tree, Thomas, strong just like you." When it was time to leave, Thomas asked with unexpected boldness, "Will you come back again?" Before Colton could respond, Faith interjected gently, "Mr. Keating is very busy with his work, Thomas." "I could return next Sunday," Colton found himself saying. "That fence line could use some attention before winter sets in properly." Faith's eyes met his, searching. "We couldn't impose further." "It's no imposition," Colton assured her, surprising himself with his sincerity. "Besides, young Thomas here makes an excellent assistant." The boy beamed, and Colton realized he'd just committed to something he'd avoided for years, forming connections that would make leaving difficult. As weeks passed, Colton's Sunday visits became a ritual. Each week brought new repairs to the small farm, mending fences, reinforcing the barn door, weatherproofing windows. With each visit, the invisible barriers between them lowered incrementally. Faith began sharing stories of her childhood in Tennessee, her journey west with her parents, meeting James at a church social when she was 17. In turn, Colton gradually revealed his own past, his parents' small ranch in Colorado, losing them to typhoid, his years drifting from one cattle outfit to another. "You never wanted to settle somewhere?" Faith asked one evening as they sat by the fireplace, Thomas already asleep in the small adjoining bedroom. Colton stared into the flames. "Settling means losing eventually. I watched my father pour his heart into our ranch for 20 years, only for it all to disappear in a matter of weeks after he and my mother took sick." "So you decided never to build anything that could be taken away," Faith observed quietly. The insight struck uncomfortably close to Colton's core. It seemed the sensible choice at the time. Faith was silent for a long moment. "When James died, I considered giving up everything, selling the farm, taking Thomas east to my cousin in St. Louis, but this land, despite all its hardships, is the only home Thomas has ever known. His father's memory lives here." She met Colton's gaze steadily. "Sometimes, Mr. Keating, what we build matters precisely because it can be lost." Her words haunted Colton during his ride back to the rocking M that night, challenging the foundation upon which he'd constructed his entire adult life. As December brought deeper snows, Pine Ridge prepared for Christmas festivities. The town's annual Christmas gathering approached, bringing a rare opportunity for scattered homesteaders and ranch hands to come together in celebration. "You should attend with Thomas," Colton suggested during his Sunday visit. "The boy would enjoy the festivities." Faith hesitated. "We haven't participated much in town gatherings since James passed." "All the more reason to go now," Colton pressed gently. "It would be good for Thomas to experience some Christmas cheer." "Perhaps," Faith conceded, "though I have nothing appropriate to wear for a social gathering. This past year hasn't allowed for such luxuries." 2 days later, Colton rode to the farm outside his usual schedule, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Faith asked, surprised by his unexpected arrival. "Something for the Christmas gathering," Colton said, suddenly feeling foolish as he extended the package. Faith unwrapped it slowly, revealing a length of rich blue fabric. "Colton, I can't accept this." "Please," he insisted. "I thought with your sewing skills you might fashion something for the gathering. The color reminded me of your eyes." A blush colored Faith's cheeks. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll attend the Christmas gathering," Colton replied, his heart pounding unexpectedly. "Both of you." After a moment, Faith nodded. "We will be there." The night of the Christmas gathering transformed the modest town hall into a haven of warmth and light. Pine boughs decorated with ribbons and paper ornaments hung from rafters, and lanterns cast a golden glow over the assembled townsfolk. Colton arrived early, uncharacteristically nervous as he waited near the entrance. When Faith entered with Thomas, Colton momentarily forgot to breathe. She had transformed the blue fabric into a simple but elegant dress that highlighted the graceful curve of her neck and the amber warmth of her eyes. Her honey-blonde hair was arranged in a modest upswept style, with a few curled tendrils framing her face. At 22, the young widow's beauty shone through her practical demeanor, drawing glances from across the room. Thomas spotted Colton first, tugging his mother's hand to lead her through the crowd. "You came," the boy exclaimed, his usual solemnity replaced by excitement. "I wouldn't miss it," Colton replied, then looked up at Faith. "You look lovely." "Thank you for the fabric," she said softly. "It was very generous." The evening unfolded in a blur of fiddle music, laughter, and more community than Colton had allowed himself to experience in years. He danced with Faith twice, keeping a respectful distance while still feeling the unfamiliar thrill of her hand in his. They shared apple cider and watched as Thomas participated in children's games, his laughter a rare and precious sound. "I haven't seen him this happy in a very long time," Faith whispered as they watched the boy. Later, as they stood outside in the crisp night air, snowflakes beginning to drift lazily from the sky, Faith turned to Colton with unexpected vulnerability in her expression. "Why have you been so kind to us, Colton?" "Truth now." The question caught him off guard. I suppose because you needed help and I could provide it." Faith shook her head slightly. "There are many in need across this territory. You chose to help us, specifically, week after week." Colton gazed at the gently falling snow, searching for words to explain something he scarcely understood himself. "When I first saw you in town, something about your determination struck me. You weren't asking for help, weren't looking for pity despite your circumstances." He paused. "And then seeing your farm, watching you fight to hold on to something meaningful despite the odds, it reminded me of my parents, of the life I ran from." Faith studied him silently, snowflakes catching in her eyelashes. "I've spent 5 years convincing myself that connections are dangerous," Colton continued, the words emerging unbidden, "that caring about people or places only ensures pain when they're inevitably lost. But watching you and Thomas, seeing how you've held onto what matters despite loss," he met her gaze directly, "it's made me question everything I thought I knew about survival out here." Before Faith could respond, shouts erupted from the town hall. People rushed outside, pointing toward the livery stable where flames had begun to lick the wooden structure. "Fire," someone yelled, and chaos ensued as men organized a bucket brigade from the town pump. "Thomas," Faith cried, searching frantically for her son who had been playing with the other children. Colton spotted him near the livery, frozen in fear as other children ran. Without hesitation, Colton sprinted toward the boy, scooping him into his arms just as a burning timber crashed down where Thomas had stood moments before. The heat seared Colton's back as he shielded the child and carried him to safety. Faith ran to them, gathering Thomas into her arms with tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered, then looked up at Colton with naked emotion. "Thank you." The town worked through the night to contain the fire. By dawn, the livery stable was lost, but they'd managed to save the surrounding buildings and all the horses. Colton's jacket was singed, and he'd sustained minor burns on his forearm, which Faith insisted on treating once the immediate danger had passed. "You could have been killed," she said quietly as she applied salve to his arm in the town doctor's office, Thomas sleeping in a chair nearby, exhausted from the night's events. "I wasn't thinking about that," Colton admitted, "only that I couldn't bear to see either of you hurt." Faith's hands stilled on his arm. "Colton," she began, then hesitated. "I think perhaps it's time we acknowledge what's happening between us." The directness of her statement startled him, and what might that be, Mrs. Browning? "Something neither of us planned," she replied steadily. "Something that frightens us both for different reasons." Colton felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "Faith, I don't have anything to offer you, no land, no home of my own. Just a drifter's life and habits too ingrained to easily break." "I'm not asking for anything," she said softly, "only that you be honest with yourself and with me about why you keep returning to our farm Sunday after Sunday." The question hung between them, demanding an answer Colton wasn't sure he was ready to give. Before he could formulate a response, the doctor returned, ending their private moment. The week following the fire, heavy snow isolated much of the countryside around Pine Ridge. Colton threw himself into his duties at the Rocking M, trying to submerge his conflicted feelings in physical labor. Faith's question echoed in his mind as he broke ice on water troughs and distributed hay to lowing cattle. Why did he continue returning to her farm? What was he hoping to find there? Sunday arrived with clear skies but temperatures well below freezing. Despite the conditions, Colton saddled his horse and made the now familiar journey to the Browning farm. As he crested the final hill, something seemed wrong. No smoke rose from the cabin chimney. Concern quickening his pace, Colton arrived to find the cabin dark and cold. He knocked urgently, receiving no answer. Fear gripped him as he tried the door, finding it unlocked. Faith. Thomas, he called, entering the frigid interior. The cabin was empty, the fireplace cold. Checking the barn, Colton found the milk cow and chickens had been tended, but there was no sign of Faith or Thomas. Returning to the cabin, he noticed a folded paper on the table addressed to him in neat handwriting. Colton, the note read, Thomas has taken ill with fever. With the doctor unavailable to travel in this weather, I've taken him to town to seek treatment. Please don't worry, Faith. The timestamp showed it had been written the previous evening. Colton immediately remounted and pushed his horse hard toward Pine Ridge, fear clawing at his throat. Winter illnesses could claim children so quickly, especially in these harsh conditions. The thought of losing Thomas, of Faith facing such grief again, was unbearable. In town, Colton found them at the doctor's small infirmary. Thomas lay pale and still on a narrow bed, Faith seated beside him, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. She looked up as Colton entered, relief washing over her features. You came, she whispered, as if she hadn't been certain he would. Of course I came, he replied, moving to her side. How is he? The fever broke an hour ago, Faith said, her voice fragile. Dr. Miller says the worst has passed, but he's very weak. Colton gently placed his hand on Thomas's small forehead, now cool and damp rather than burning with fever. He's strong like his mother, he'll pull through. Faith's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned into Colton's shoulder. I was so afraid, she admitted. All I could think was that I couldn't lose him too. Colton wrapped his arm around her shoulders, holding her as she released the fear she'd been containing for Thomas's sake. In that moment, something crystallized within him, a certainty that had been forming gradually over the weeks of Sunday visits and shared meals. The very connection he had feared for so long now seemed like the only thing worth fighting for. You won't lose him, Colton promised, and you won't face this alone. They remained at the doctor's through the night, taking turns sitting with Thomas. By morning, the boy had improved enough to ask for water and recognize Colton with a weak smile. You came to help, Thomas murmured, his small hand reaching for Colton's. Always, Colton replied, the simple word carrying the weight of a vow. Once Thomas was well enough to travel, Colton insisted on bringing both him and Faith to the Rocking M, where the ranch house offered better shelter and care than the cold cabin. Mrs. Marshall, the ranch owner's wife, welcomed them warmly, providing a comfortable room where Thomas could continue his recovery. During their stay, Colton maintained his duties as foreman while checking on them frequently. One evening, as Thomas slept peacefully, Faith joined Colton on the ranch house porch despite the cold. I never properly thanked you, she said, drawing her shawl tighter. No thanks necessary, Colton replied. Anyone would have done the same. Faith shook her head. Not anyone, Colton, you, she paused, gathering courage. Before Thomas fell ill, you never answered my question about why you keep returning to us. Colton gazed out at the snow-covered landscape, the words he'd been avoiding finally finding their way to the surface. Because when I'm with you and Thomas, I feel something I haven't felt since my parents died, like I belong somewhere again, like I matter to someone beyond what work I can provide. He turned to face her directly. I've spent years convincing myself that not caring was safer, that if I never built anything, never loved anyone, I couldn't lose everything like I did before. His voice softened. But watching you fight for your farm, for Thomas, for the life you're determined to build despite your loss, it made me realize I've been existing, not living. Faith's eyes glistened in the lantern light. I was afraid too, you know. After James died, I built walls to protect myself and Thomas. When you started coming around, helping without expecting anything in return, being kind to my son, she took a shaky breath. It terrified me how quickly you became important to us. Faith, Colton began, then hesitated, searching for the right words. I can't promise that loss won't come again. That's the nature of life out here. But I'm starting to think that what makes the risk worthwhile is what we build together in the meantime. He gently took her hand in his. I care for you, Faith Browning, for Thomas too. More than I thought possible after so many years of guarding against exactly these feelings. Faith's fingers tightened around his, and I care for you, Colton Keating, despite my best efforts not to. The confession hung between them, both promise and question in the cold night air. After Thomas had fully recovered, Faith insisted they return to their farm despite Colton's concerns about them being alone there. It's our home, she explained simply. We need to face it, make it warm again. Colton respected her decision but rode over daily to check on them, bringing supplies and ensuring they were managing. On one such visit in late January, he arrived to find Faith struggling with the hand pump, which had frozen solid overnight. Let me, he offered, taking the handle from her reddened hands. As he worked to thaw and repair the pump, Faith brought him hot coffee, standing closer than usual as they talked about spring planting and calving season approaching at the Rocking M. I've been thinking, Colton said finally, setting down his cup. This place needs more than occasional Sunday repairs. The eastern field could yield better if properly irrigated, and with more chickens and perhaps a few head of cattle, you could make this farm truly profitable. Faith regarded him curiously. Those are ambitious plans for someone else's property, Mr. Keating. Colton met her gaze steadily. What if it wasn't someone else's property? What if it was ours? The words hung between them, their implication unmistakable. Faith's eyes widened. Colton, she began cautiously, what exactly are you suggesting? He stepped closer, taking her cold hands in his. I'm suggesting that I'm tired of fighting against what I feel for you and Thomas. That the thought of riding away from here come spring feels like tearing out a piece of myself. He drew a deep breath. I'm asking if you might consider making this farm a home for 3 instead of 2. Faith searched his face, her expression a mixture of hope and hesitation. You've spent years avoiding attachments. How can I be certain you won't wake up one morning and feel trapped by the very connection you're proposing? It was a fair question, one Colton had asked himself repeatedly in recent weeks. Because for the first time since I lost my parents, I'm more afraid of leaving than staying. The thought of riding away from you and Thomas terrifies me more than any risk that comes with putting down roots. He squeezed her hands gently. I can't promise I won't make mistakes, but I can promise that I'll fight just as hard for our family as you fought for this farm. Tears welled in Faith's eyes. You consider us family already. I do, Colton admitted, though I'd like to make it official if you'll have me. Before Faith could respond, Thomas burst from the cabin, having overheard their conversation through the open window. Are you going to be my pa now? He asked Colton directly, his young face serious. Colton knelt to the boy's level. Only if you and your mother want me to be Thomas. It would be my greatest honor. Thomas considered this with grave importance. Would you teach me to ride a real horse, and fix things when they break, and stay even when it snows? All of those things and more, Colton promised. Every day, not just Sundays. Thomas turned to his mother, his decision already made. Can he stay, Ma, please? Faith looked between her son and the man who had gradually, persistently worked his way into both their hearts. You're certain about this, Colton, truly certain. In answer, Colton reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple silver ring. I've carried this since my mother died. It was hers and my grandmother's before that. He held it out to Faith. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. With Thomas watching solemnly, Faith extended her trembling hand. Then yes, she whispered as Colton slipped the ring onto her finger. We would very much like you to stay. The wedding took place in early March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the Montana landscape. The small church in Pine Ridge was filled with townsfolk and ranchers who had watched the quiet courtship unfold over the winter months. Mrs. Marshall had helped Faith fashion a wedding dress from the remaining blue fabric, adorned with lace borrowed from the dressmaker in town. As Faith walked down the aisle toward him, her honey-blonde hair arranged with wildflowers and a few early spring blossoms, Colton felt the last of his protective walls dissolve completely. Thomas stood proudly at his side, serving as his best man despite being only 4 years old, his solemn face transformed by a smile that rivaled the spring sunshine. Dearly beloved, the minister began, and Colton marveled at how those simple words now filled him with anticipation rather than fear. The vows they exchanged were straightforward but deeply felt, promises to face whatever the frontier might bring together rather than alone. When Colton leaned forward to kiss his bride, sealing their union before the gathered community, he understood what Faith had meant months earlier. Some things were precious precisely because they could be lost, their value measured in the courage it took to cherish them despite that risk. The reception that followed at the Rocking M Ranch was a testament to the community they had both, in different ways, been reluctant to fully join. Neighbors brought food and gifts, offering not just congratulations but practical help for the spring planting and promised assistance expanding the chicken coop and building a proper cattle pen. "Looks like you found something worth staying for," Mr. Marshall observed as he shook Colton's hand. "Yes, sir," Colton agreed, watching as Faith laughed with the women of the community, Thomas playing nearby with other children. "I finally have." That evening, after the celebrations had ended and they had returned to the farm, their farm now, Colton carried Faith across the threshold of the cabin. Thomas had fallen asleep on the ride home, and Colton gently placed him in his bed before returning to his new wife in the main room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Keating," he said softly, still marveling at how natural the words felt. Faith stepped into his embrace. "It feels different now," she observed, looking around the familiar cabin, warmer somehow. "That's because it's no longer just a place to survive," Colton replied, understanding exactly what she meant. "It's where we'll build our life together." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Faith rested her head on Colton's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never expected to find love again," she confessed. "After James died, I thought that chapter of my life was closed forever." Colton stroked her hair gently. "And I never expected to want to stay in one place again. We've both been proven wrong in the best possible way." Faith propped herself up to look at him. "Promise me something, Colton." "Anything." "Promise me that when times get hard, and they will, you'll remember this moment. That you'll remember why you chose to stay rather than ride away." Colton pulled her closer. "I promise, this family, you and Thomas, you're not just a place I'm passing through. You're my home now, wherever we might be." As spring blossomed into summer, the Keating farm began to transform. With Colton's knowledge of cattle and Faith's skilled management, they expanded beyond subsistence farming. The eastern field, properly irrigated as Colton had suggested, yielded a bountiful crop. They added 6 head of cattle and doubled the chicken flock, selling eggs and butter in town for a steady income. Thomas thrived under Colton's guidance, learning to ride the gentle mare Colton had purchased specifically for him and developing a natural affinity for working with the animals. The solemn child gradually gave way to a more confident, joyful boy who delighted in having a father figure who kept his promises and returned home each night. By autumn, the community barely remembered a time when Colton Keating had been the drifting cowboy who never stayed in one place. He had become an integral part of Pine Ridge, respected for his knowledge of cattle and his unfailing willingness to help neighbors in need. Faith, too, had blossomed, no longer the struggling widow but a vital member of the community, hosting quilting circles and contributing her excellent baking to church socials. On a golden October evening, as they sat on their newly built porch watching Thomas play with the family dog, Faith took Colton's hand with an expression he'd come to recognize, one that meant she had important news to share. "I visited Dr. Miller yesterday," she said quietly, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Colton turned to her, concern and hope mingling in his expression. "Is everything all right?" Faith placed his hand gently on her stomach. "Everything is perfect. We're going to have a baby in the spring." Joy unlike anything Colton had ever experienced washed through him. He gathered Faith into his arms, mindful of her condition even in his excitement. "A baby," he repeated, the word filled with wonder. "Thomas is going to be a big brother." Faith laughed, her amber eyes bright with happiness. "He already suspects something. He asked me yesterday if we might get a little sister for him like the Petersons just did." Colton gazed at Thomas, now racing the dog around the oak tree that James had planted, the tree that continued growing, marking the passage of time and the endurance of family bonds that transcended loss. "I never imagined this," Colton admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "A year ago, I was convinced that the safest way to live was to keep moving, never allowing myself to care too deeply about anyone or anything." Faith leaned against his shoulder. "And now?" "Now I understand what I was really running from all those years." He kissed her forehead gently. not from loss, but from the courage it takes to build something meaningful despite knowing it can be lost. From the kind of love that makes the risk worthwhile. As the sun set over their flourishing farm, painting the autumn landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Colton Keating held his wife close and watched his son play beneath the family tree. The false belief that had driven him for so many years, that attachment only led to pain, had been replaced by a deeper truth. That family, in all its vulnerability and strength, was the most precious thing the frontier had to offer. The lonely cowboy who had once believed the frontier was no place for love had found not only love but belonging, not despite the harshness of the land, but because of the resilience it demanded and the connections it made possible. In Faith and Thomas, Colton had found not just a woman to love and a child to nurture, but the true meaning of family, a meaning that would continue to unfold as their own family grew with the coming spring.